Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, vaccines for over 50s. The government moves the goalposts on its inoculation strategy, but will you be lining up to get your jab? Australia's climate credentials under scrutiny as the Prime Minister prepares to take his seat at Joe Biden's Leaders' Summit. And hands off, the federal government vetoes deals between Victoria and several foreign powers, including China's Belt and Road Blitz. Joining me on the panel tonight, incoming vice-chancellor at the University of Wollongong and former Dean of Nursing at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, Patricia Davidson. Welcome home.
Thanks for having me.
In Canberra tonight, political journalist Malcolm Farr. Lovely to see you again. Been a long time.
Thank you, ma'am.
In Perth, policy fellow at the Perth US Asia Centre and co-founder of youth lobby group Think Forward, Sonia Arakkal. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And in London, joining us from London, former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, who was also the High Commissioner to the UK and once Liberal Party leader. Good to see you, Mr Downer.
It's a pleasure to be on the show.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. For the second time this week, the National Cabinet has met to discuss Australia's troubled vaccine rollout. In the last fortnight, the number of vaccines administered has plateaued, plagued by issues of supply and growing hesitancy. So, in an effort to get things moving, the National Cabinet has agreed to expand the rollout to anyone over 50.
We also agreed to bring forward for over 50s, so outside 1A and 1B, over 50 Australians. This would be vaccination for AstraZeneca, and that would be brought forward for the GP respiratory clinics and state and territories from the 3rd of May and from the 17th of May for GPs. Once again, National Cabinet affirmed the importance of GPs being the principal way in which we're seeking to vaccinate the country, and the fact they've already done half that job and that is only continuing to grow, I think underscores that.
There are, however, warnings that none of this should come at the expense of vaccinating our most vulnerable. On Tuesday, we reported that just 6% of disability care residents had received a vaccine, and it's not clear when the rest will be delivered. Patricia, how much of a recalibration is this, given that GPs remain the main way, as the Prime Minister said, that we'll get the vaccine, and there was some thought that we might be moving to hubs, mass vaccination, Bunnings, car parks, that sort of thing?
Well, thanks, Ellen, for the question. And I can talk about my experience from the US. And firstly, I think it's really important that the GPs remain front and centre of the individual's care, but I think there's many ways to do that. I really can't see a way forward without mass vaccination clinics. So many general practitioners I've spoken to within surgeries have talked about how it will be hard to roll out hard and fast. I mean, my experience at the mass vaccination clinics in the United States have been that they've been very effective, efficient, good use of workflow, and patients seem to be very happy there.
Okay. And so tell me about your experiences at those clinics, because you actually volunteered, and they are in fact relying on volunteers to get these extraordinary numbers of people vaccinated every day.
That's absolutely correct. And I think a lot of people aren't aware that many of those mass vaccination centres in the United States are run by nurses, doctors, working in additional hours.
But how does it work? What happens?
What happens? So you have coordinating centres. So, for example, at Johns Hopkins, where I came from, that was a coordinating centre. So from that hub, people would be going out to residential care facilities, going to blocks of housing where older people were, going into homes for homebound elders, and also working with community health workers to access people with vaccine hesitancy or concerned about how they would be able to obtain the vaccine. One of the big challenges in the US has been actually getting an appointment because it's all been computerised and not coordinated. So I think there's many lessons to learn, but the mass vaccination centres in Australia, the ones that are up and running, have seemed to be very effective.
And if we don't do it in the way that you're describing, whether that's Bunnings car parks, because Bunnings have very kindly offered that, New South Wales Premier today was out at Homebush, the former Olympic site, saying, here you go, this is a huge area, there's great car parking, come on in. If we don't do it that way and we keep doing it GP clinic by GP clinic, even if they are setting up tents in the car park, how long might it take us to get through this program?
Well, it might, some epidemiologists have sort of projected out to, 40 months to get this all, to get to herd immunity to 85%.
40.
My husband actually got his vaccine at an amusement park in a car park where you drive up, you have the vaccine and you park for 15 minutes and then drive away. I just think there is such a big risk with what's happening around the world. We've seen what's happened in India today with the highest number of case counts. And there are real risks to Australia, and if we can't get the borders open, it's a real risk to our economy and a risk to our place on the international stage.
Malcolm Farr, can I turn to you? How much of a recalibration do you think it is in terms of trying to get the over 50s vaccinated, which is the priority now, right?
Well, it seems a pretty logical step, I would suggest. I wonder why GPs are put off until May 17 before they can join this process, even though the Prime Minister and others have said how important they are. But let's not ignore something that you pointed to earlier. There is still a lot of vaccination that has to be done of residents of disability facilities, of aged care facilities, and of the staff that tend to those people in those facilities. And Labor will keep hammering this and using it against the Morrison government's management of this crisis. And just today, Anthony Albanese went to a St Kilda aged care facility where no one, staff or resident, had been vaccinated. Those areas are going to be, should have been treated first before we started talking about expanding the qualifications to those aged over 50.
But that's not happening, Malcolm, until the 3rd of May. For the over 50s. So does that matter? I mean, the way you read it, do you think that they will have got through 1A and 1B by that time, by the 3rd of May, and therefore you change the policy and you say, OK, over 50s come along because we've got the AstraZeneca and we don't have the preferred vaccine for the under 50s, so we'll do it that way?
Yeah, that's fine. Look, and I think some GPs who do have access to the AstraZeneca coming up with very clever excuses to get some of their regular patients vaccinated, saying, well, you had a sore toe 3 years ago, it might be better if you were vaccinated now. I'm being facetious, of course, but using part of their medical history, their health history, to get them in earlier than they might normally have been brought in for a vaccination. And I think we're going to see a lot of flexibility among GPs to do that. But again, I say, why can't GPs be brought into this hastened process earlier rather than waiting till May 17?
Sonia, it was your Premier, Mark McGowan, who started raising concerns about people coming from high-risk countries into Australia, and predominantly India. Tragic out of India today, 321,731 cases of COVID in India today, the highest daily coronavirus case count in a single country since the pandemic began. So there's going to be a 30% reduction in flights coming from India, and anybody who comes from any high-risk country via a third port has to get a COVID test and a clear COVID test 72 hours before they get on that plane to Australia. It's interesting that the state premiers are taking the lead on this.
It is interesting. It seems to be a growing trend during the pandemic era that state premiers and governments are the people we're turning to, our voters are turning to for leadership on issues, especially when it comes to the vaccine and borders. But I think we have to be careful in terms of reducing capacity of bringing home vulnerable Australians overseas. There is a human right imperative for us to look after our own citizens that are in countries that are struggling with coronavirus and the citizens who themselves might be very vulnerable. And I'm not sure that reducing the capacity of our quarantine functions is a sensible place to start. And it really underlies the importance of our vaccination rollout and how important it is that we do this quickly, efficiently and well. The sooner we get vaccinated, the sooner our economy can open up, and the sooner we can make sure Australians stranded overseas who need our help can be looked after by their government.
There's a really good point. They're interconnected. Alexander Downer, this is a wicked problem, isn't it, for the Australian government? You're Australia's longest-serving foreign minister. Imagine it. The highest number of Australians stuck anywhere in the world in India, 9,000 people desperate to get home. And you make the call in National Cabinet today, righto, we're going to reduce by 30% the flights coming in from that country, and we're going to put all these restrictions on people coming and going to high-risk countries. You can't go for a wedding, you can't go for a funeral.
Yeah, well, Australians have a right, and as Sonia says, a human right, to be able to return to their own country. So governments, state and federal, it's, by the way, not one or the other, the state and federal have to make the facilities available for them to be able to come home. Obviously, if those people have been vaccinated, that should make a substantial difference. If people have been vaccinated and they want to come home, I can't see why they have to go into medi-hotels. They could free up spaces in medi-hotels for people who haven't been vaccinated who want to come home. But it is a difficult problem, and as is the vaccine rollout. I mean, one of the issues is the availability of vaccine. In Australia, that's not been as available as it has been here in the UK. Another is the mindset of the public in Australia, because COVID isn't rampant in the community. And you've seen almost no one die. 107, 108 people die as a result of it. In the UK, a large number of people have died. There are many people who have had COVID. And so people are much more willing to go and get vaccinated in these mass vaccination centres. So, you know, it does depend on the circumstances. They do differ from country to country.
In Australia, we have had, just to correct that, over 900 deaths. But the point Mr Downer makes...
Oh, sorry, 900.
Yeah, Alexander
907.
makes... Patricia, is a powerful one. You were saying to me earlier that in public health terms, it's not only a personal tragedy for the Central Coast woman who lost her life and that of her family, but in public health terms, that's kind of a bit of a disaster for a vaccine rollout, to have that happen sort of almost before any members of the general public have been vaccinated.
Yeah, so really unfortunate, and my heart goes out to that family, and that's you know, we can look at numbers from a macro term, but they are individual. And there have been other vaccine rollouts around the world that have been, if you like, sabotaged by this kind of really random early event. And I think it's going to take time for people to get confidence. I think it's really important. The World Health Organization has a big campaign about misinformation and disinformation. And I think helping people to really understand the risk is very important. And that could be a critical role for the GPs to actually work with the individual and see the risk.
Because it's hard, right? It's hard to assess. As Alexander says, in a country that, you know, we feel like we have no COVID, it makes sense at a population level that you draw an arbitrary line at 50. But it sort of doesn't make sense at an individual level. If I'm 51 and somebody else is 49 and they get a vaccine that's got greater efficacy and greater safety, are Australians going to line up for this, right?
Yeah, but I think Australians line up for many therapeutics every day that have that may have a risk profile. You know, we all take medications. All medications have a risk, and we kind of accept the risk. But the politicisation of the COVID-19 pandemic, the front and centre, makes people really terrified. Every day people have coronary artery bypass surgery or tonsillectomies. Everything carries a risk. And I think Australia has done so incredibly well as a nation, as a population, and it would be really sad if we didn't just take it to the next level, get to herd immunity and open up the country and stand on the world stage as the players we are.
Well,
completely right.
Yeah. You were just saying, Alexander, that you've had your first shot. And you did the maths. What did you reckon your chances were of getting a blood clot?
Well, I've forgotten now what the probability that I might. Well, I'm over 50, by the way.
Are you?
So,
Good. Thanks for clarifying.
I know that will come as a surprise to everybody, but.
Yes.
I mean, the probability is absolutely tiny that I could contract a blood clot of some kind. But as Patricia says, I mean, every time you walk out the front door of your house, you're taking a risk, and we all live with risks. But I mean, I think, and I also agree, I think Australia has done a fantastic job. It's a pity it's been politicised a little bit. People are making party political points from time to time, which are a bit unprepossessing. But as overall, Australia has done a great job, but it does have to open up, and it can only open up once the country has been more thoroughly vaccinated, and the rollout needs to move as fast as is practical.
I noticed Malcolm Farr had a laugh at the political comment, but we must move on. The government has made good on its promise.
That's the press gallery for you, always party politics.
Not the politicians, it's
Alexander.
the press gallery. OK, thanks for clarifying. Let's see the start of that intro again, if I can. The government has made good on its promise to tear up agreements with foreign governments that it deems not in the national interest. Victoria's controversial Belt and Road Agreement with China is among the first to go. It's been ruled unlawful under the government's new foreign veto laws.
It's about ensuring that we have a consistent approach to foreign policy across all levels of government, and it isn't about any one country. We are always, as I've been consistent in saying, very careful and considered in how we do this, and making sure that we continue to emphasise our commitment to engaging with China. We are asking all countries around the world to respect our government's decision-making authority. And I hope that if there are any concerns, they'll be raised directly with the government.
The Chinese embassy has hit back at the decision, describing it as unreasonable and provocative.
It further shows that the Australian government has no sincerity in improving China-Australia relations. It is bound to bring further damage to bilateral relations and will only end up hurting itself.
It comes amid tensions within the Five Eyes intelligence alliance over how to manage a rising China. Now, New Zealand has found itself isolated from the US, the UK, Canada and Australia, saying they are uncomfortable expanding the remit of Five Eyes to pressure China.
We do value the Five Eyes relationship. We receive significant benefits from being a part of that relationship, and they are close allies and friends in terms of common values and principles. But whether or not that framework needs to be invoked every time on every issue, especially in the human rights space, is something that we have expressed further views about.
For more on this, we're joined by Research Fellow at the Asia Institute of the University of Melbourne, Melissa Conley-Tyler, who is currently in Taipei for a fellowship with the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry, looking at foreign relations under the Biden administration. Melissa, thanks so much for joining us.
Good evening, Alan.
You argue the federal government should not have vetoed the Victoria deal. Why not?
I don't think the legislation is necessary, and I'd be interested in Alexander Downer's views. You know, in 11 years, he didn't think legislation like this was required. What this legislation looks at is all agreements by state governments, local governments and universities to vet them against the minister's absolute discretion of what might be adverse to Australia's foreign relations. This is a really wide test, and there's no evidence of genuine harm. So when the minister was asked, you know, why were these 4 particular agreements vetoed, she said, can't go into details, national security, important that we have consistency, but again, no sense that there is a real harm being done. Instead, what's happened is that $25 million has been reallocated in DFAT's budget at a time when the Department of Foreign Affairs is the worst funded it's ever been in Australia's history. 1,000 agreements have been put through by state and territory governments and reviewed one by one. And what we're getting, the result of all of that, is that we're having the Belt and Road Initiative memorandums of understanding cancelled, and these are non-binding memorandum that did not make the state of Victoria do anything at all.
Okay. You quote in an article you've written for The Conversation an American author who says diplomacy is no longer the stiff waltz of elites but the jazzy dance of the masses. So one assumes that in Australian instance the stiff waltz of the elites is DFAT. Who are the jazzy dancers that you would like to see tangoing with Beijing?
Well, it's not necessarily just with Beijing, it's with all countries. International engagement benefits us as a country.
So who else does it other than the diplomats?
It's everybody. So it can be local governments have sister city relationships, that you have state governments doing trade, you have universities who are doing international engagement, joint research, student exchanges, joint conferences and discussions. All these things are important for Australia to be engaging internationally, to be taking what's in the world and using that for our benefit. Closing ourselves off from all of that isn't in our interest. And the idea that we all have to speak with one voice, that in Canberra decides what all of those actors should be saying and thinking and doing, that seems to me profoundly against who we are as a nation.
Alexander Downer, the Foreign Minister Marise Payne anticipated there would be, quote, further decisions made on agreements between Australian institutions and foreign powers in the future. In other words, other things might be vetoed. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I guess it depends what the agreements are. When I was the Foreign Minister, and I was the Foreign Minister for nearly 12 years, there was there was a collaborative arrangement between the states and the federal government and indeed Australian institutions. So if a state government wanted to sign some kind of an international agreement, obviously that had to be within the Constitution of Australia, where the Commonwealth Government has responsibility for external relations.
So is the Victorian agreement, the Belt and Road Agreement with Victoria, unconstitutional?
Right. And so the federal government is responsible for external relations. That's why the legislation that has been passed is constitutional, that Marise Payne has put through the Parliament.
But just to go back to my question.
I'm not saying the Belt and Road Initiative was unconstitutional. That's rather a different point. I'm not really making that point. I'm just making the point that typically the state governments would make agreements, but those agreements should be consistent with the overall direction of Australian foreign policy. And the same with other institutions, not contrary to the direction of Australian foreign policy. Now, in the case of the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't know the extent to which DFAT were consulted by the Victorian government or the minister at the time, who must have been Julie Bishop, I suppose. I'm not quite sure. I don't know. But what I do know is that the federal government had decided as a matter of policy not to sign up to the Belt and Road Initiative. And if one of the states were to go off and do precisely that, then that obviously cuts across the national government's foreign policy. And that is an unfortunate situation. It never arose in my time. And I don't know how it arose here, but I think it's very unfortunate that it ever happened.
OK, Malcolm, can I turn to you? If you sort of look to the initial memorandum of understanding signed between Victoria and Beijing, it's pretty short on detail, but it seems pretty innocuous. It promises to increase the participation of Chinese infrastructure companies in Victoria's infrastructure construction program, encouraging Chinese infrastructure firms to establish a presence in Victoria and bid for major projects, and send delegations of Victorian infrastructure firms to China to, quote, better understand opportunities. Why would we not be willing to do business with China on such seemingly innocuous terms? And if not on those terms, on what terms do we do business with China?
Well, why was this exercise so vague? Look, one point, which might sound a bit harsh, but the Belt and Road Initiative is not an exercise in sino-altruism. Beijing throws it around to whomever will take it because it believes it can get something out of it. Secondly, the point that Alexander raised is also important. The legislation used by Marise Payne was aimed at consistency in foreign policy, and it was backed by federal Labor in federal Parliament, passively rather than enthusiastically, but Labor supported that principle. So on both those grounds, what Minister Payne did was perfectly understandable and acceptable. But what does she do next? She says there might be other things. People already are asking about what might happen with the Chinese 99-year lease on the port in Darwin. Is that project that might be given the kibosh? We'll wait and see how enthusiastic the Minister is.
OK, but Melissa, for clarity, are you saying that under this legislation, and frankly I can't recall, those sorts of things you were referring to, sister city agreements, think tanks, sports diplomacy, international education, student mobility, corporate diplomacy, research collaboration, that all comes within the remit of this legislation and can be vetoed by the Foreign Minister?
Absolutely, on any grounds that she sees fit, with no review or appeal.
So that's very different to any power you ever had, Alexander Downer.
Well, it is in a legislative sense, but I go back to what I said, and that is that you do want the country to have a foreign policy. You can't have it spraying around with different states.
Well, apparently we have today. We got through the Cold War all right without it.
No. I mean, a sister city relationship or something like that, it's not going to be controversial.
No.
I just made the point earlier that there were typically consultations as different levels of government engaged with the rest of the world. But the Belt and Road Initiative, as Malcolm says, has a particular meaning and is particularly significant. It is the way China projects its soft power and in some respects its harder power, its economic power. And it is a matter of some concern, particularly to liberal democratic countries. And the Australian government is one of a number of those liberal democratic countries which hasn't wanted to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. So having made that decision, and for a state government then to sign up to the Belt and Road Initiative, symbolically is very confusing and is not good diplomacy for Australia. So getting rid of that is an inevitable consequence of that disconnect between the federal and the state government.
Sonia, can I turn to you, get you to put on your Perth US Asia Centre hat? What's your view not only of the legislation, well, mainly of the legislation, and the fact that this is quite a step for the federal government to veto this agreement, and as the panellists have been saying, it was quite a step for Victoria to sign it in the first place?
Let's have a little perspective here. So we know that Marise Payne reviewed over 1,000 agreements and only 4 of them have been vetoed. So that means 96.6% of agreements that our states, universities, research institutions, think tanks have entered into are fine, and I can guarantee you some of them will be with China. So I'm not sure this is an example of overreach, but actually a prudent message that the federal government is sending to our institutions and our states about, hey, when you go out there and do, as Melissa said, an important role in our foreign policy and having collaborations and cooperations and agreement, make sure you check in with us and make sure you're acting in line with what our stated foreign policy objectives are. So I think this is a welcome development, and one, unfortunately, that isn't as dramatic as we would like it to be. But as is the issue with China, when we talk about foreign policy and actions that Australia takes in this context of investment, it's tempting to be drawn into the magnet of the Chinese and the glamour of the Chinese relationship. But when it comes to investment in Australia, which is a very important part of our economy, foreign investment in Australia, we have other options. Right, our neighbours, Indonesia, Vietnam, India, have growing populations and money to invest in our country. So I hope the conversation doesn't end with, what or is purely framed within a China context, but that we can extend it to diversify and focus on our closest neighbours.
All right, so Patricia, you're about to become the vice-chancellor of the University of Wollongong, and presumably they've had a reliance on foreign international students, as all universities around Australia have. So the Chinese have come out and said that this is unreasonable and provocative. Presumably, if I'm sitting in Canberra and I'm looking at export income, I think, you know what? The value of iron ore has gone through the roof. It's nearly at record highs, $190 a tonne. The last federal budget thought it would be $55 a tonne. So I'm terribly sorry about your university, but off you go. How worried are you?
Well, I think the whole sector is worried, and I think COVID-19 has sent shockwaves around the world, and universities are trying to recalibrate and determine their value proposition in society, which is high. All of us in the health sector were just so amazed how quickly, we got a vaccine, and this is all about science. I think Australia has a huge potential to play an even bigger place on the world stage in science, in technology, in the arts, and that's where it happens in universities. And I really think that we have to think about what is the internationalisation of education. I really don't like us thinking about international students. I think it stigmatises those students. I really want us to think about a model of internationalisation of education where we really look at everybody in the world, and as other panellists have said, we are all interconnected and depend on each other for innovation and discovery.
One last question, Christine, before you go. Melissa, before you go, will Patricia have to get in touch with DFAT if she wants to have research collaboration and students studying abroad?
Yes, she will. And that'll be the next tranche. When the Minister says there may be further agreements invalidated, that's because the university information hasn't come through yet. This has only been looking at the local government and the state government. My concern is that this is going to hurt universities because it breaks that virtuous cycle of international engagement. What you want is an atmosphere where our best are working with the world's best, not an atmosphere of suspicion where dealing with anyone overseas is seen as somehow suspect, requiring to be reported and requiring to be vetted. My major concern with all of this is we're taking things that never used to be seen as foreign policy, were never seen as national security, and we're putting them all under that bucket now. We're saying that student exchange or high school visits or visual artist exchange, suddenly that's stuff that is foreign policy and the federal government should control it. In my mind, that's part of ordinary international engagement, our society engaging for mutual benefit with societies around the world, and we shouldn't be stigmatising that.
That was to be the last word. Patricia, what do you think of that? Are you happy to go to DFAT?
Well, look, I think there's always some bad actors that change it for everyone. And I think, my experience in the US, there were some pretty profound examples of espionage and security infringements. What I'd seen, though, is that trickled down to everybody, to people from China feeling uncomfortable, feeling stigmatised.
As if they might be some sort of spy or something within the university.
There's been a lot of vulnerability. And I think also the othering of naming the China virus by the previous administration has led to an escalation of real violence against Asian Americans. So I think language really matters. And maybe we have to put it in perspective. If it is 4 out of 1,000, maybe there's justification, but understanding the rationale is really important.
Okay, so you think it actually might calm those sorts of racial tensions and reduce suspicions on campuses if, research projects and international student exchanges were given a tick of approval?
Well, I think that would be way too bureaucratic and that would never happen. But I think the risks are low. So it's back to that. The risks are low. And I think we have to think about, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a very different model of what is student exchange. So I think we need to really calibrate and think about the risks. But internationalisation is critical for Australia and we have to move forward.
Alexander Dow?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Patricia has said, actually. I'm very passionate about internationalising Australia all the more, including through our universities. But just to say that when foreign students come to Australia, particularly at the research level, they need a visa. And there were occasions when I was the foreign minister when I did stop foreign students coming into Australia because they were proposing to do research in very sensitive areas. So, for example, I do remember Iranian students sometimes being stopped because of our concern about the Iranian nuclear program. So this happens. The federal government has monitored these things.
Melissa Coney, thank you so much for joining us. Melissa Coney-Tyler is a research fellow at the Asia Institute of the University of Melbourne. You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, incoming Vice-Chancellor at the University of Wollongong, Patricia Davidson. In Canberra, political journalist Malcolm Farr. In Perth, policy fellow at the Perth US Asia Centre and co-founder of Think Forward, Sonia Arakkal. And in London, former Minister for Foreign Affairs and Liberal Party leader Alexander Downer. Scott Morrison is hours away from sitting down with 39 of his nearest and dearest world leaders as part of Joe Biden's Climate Crisis Summit. Every nation attending is expected to offer up plans or targets to reduce emissions. And as he logs on for tonight's meeting, he may have this message from the US Secretary of State ringing in his ears.
Our diplomats will challenge the practices of countries whose action or inaction is setting the world back. When countries continue to rely on coal for a significant amount of their energy, or invest in new coal factories, or allow for massive deforestation, they will hear from the United States and our partners about how harmful these actions are.
And if that wasn't clear enough, how about this? A Biden administration official has told The Guardian it's, quote, insufficient for Australia to follow its existing trajectory. And what does that trajectory look like? Well, the Prime Minister gave us an idea yesterday, promising $540 million for clean hydrogen and carbon capture programs.
The world is moving to a new energy economy, a net zero economy, when it comes to energy. And Australia will play a huge part in that. We're not going to tax our way into the new energy economy. We're going to ensure that we achieve it through our investments, our smart investments in the energy technology.
For more on this, we're joined in Canberra by climate change expert at the Australian National University and former science advisor to the Australian Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, Will Steffen. G'day, Will.
G'day, how you going?
What do you think of this idea, technology not targets, technology not taxes? Can we innovate our way to the required lowering of emissions in Australia?
I would say that we need targets and technology. It's important that we do have targets. For example, we're a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement, which has an overarching goal of holding temperature to well below 2 degrees. Once you sign up on that, once you agree to that, you've got to set a roadmap, a target of how you're going to achieve that. And that involves emission reduction step by step and a timetable to get there. It's sort of like saying, I'm going to go from Canberra to Melbourne, but I don't really want a roadmap and I don't care whether I get there. And I may wander around through the snowy mountains and never quite get there in time. You actually have to have a plan to be able to deliver on our Paris commitments.
OK, but so the Minister, Angus Taylor, says, well, look, this is not a ceiling on our ambitions, what we've promised. When he was asked today, well, you know, other nations have promised twice what Australia has promised in terms of emission cuts. And he says, well, it's not a ceiling on our ambitions, it's a floor. We don't lie about it. Other countries say they're going to cut emissions and don't meet their targets. So why not just take us at our word?
I think every country now has to stick to their word. If we want to meet the Paris climate goal, there is no other way other than to get emissions down and down rapidly. The science is pretty clear here. Globally, we need to cut emissions at least in half by 2030, and we have to achieve net zero emissions. That is, no emissions that are not offset by uptake of carbon. We need to do that by 2040. And I think Australia needs to play in that game. We need to be a leader in that game. And in fact, we have the resources to do even better than that global target.
OK, and what if we do? What if we do? We just don't go trumpeting tonight on the Skype call that we're going to do it. I wonder if it is Skype.
Yeah.
But we actually do. We do it. We get there.
Well, that would be fantastic if we did. And if we do that, what we will find, I am sure, is that it's going to be not only benefits for the global climate system, which is the #1 thing, but benefits for our economy, benefits for our employment.
But you don't think we will, do you? You don't think we will without coordination from Canberra. And why is that?
This has got to be a whole of society effort. We can't do it piecemeal. It's great that states and local jurisdictions are taking action, but we've got to coordinate it at the national level to make sure that we're going to meet that target, that we'll make sure we're meeting efficiencies that are out there by working together.
Okay.
Every other country is a signatory. They're operating at the national level. Why shouldn't we?
Malcolm Farr, just a few months back, you remember this fella called Donald Trump was the president of the United States, and the US was out of Paris, and now under Biden they've yo-yoed back in and they believe the climate science and they're scolding the rest of the world. And presumably the United States is one election and a 78-year-old president away from yo-yoing back into climate denial. Why should we be lectured by America?
Well, that'll... sorry, Will?
Yeah, to Malcolm, if I can.
Yeah, sorry.
Look, I think that is one aspect of the Biden commentary that will be used by the Prime Minister. He will say, we will not be dictated to by other countries. And looking at you, Joe Biden. But there are some things still left dangling, no matter who is raising these issues. And that is, will Australia officially subscribe to net zero by 2050? All states have done so. Great chunks of business have done so. The Business Council of Australia says we should be moving to net zero by 2050. There's one person who hasn't. His name is Scott Morrison. So if Joe Biden can put enough pressure on Australia, he's already put enough pressure to squeeze out $500 million in new projects through this summit tonight. But if he can put even more pressure on Australia, maybe Prime Minister Morrison will join the net zero club and officially commit to it and come up with a program for it.
Sonia, the Prime Minister goes in tonight to this meeting with $500 million for hydrogen research and carbon capture and storage. Do you see that as anything more than a diplomatic fig leaf?
Given the quantum of the money that he's put towards hydrogen, I can understand why people would say that. I think we should welcome the investment in hydrogen as a technology. I personally am very excited by it, not just in terms of reducing our domestic emissions, but also the potential of the geopolitical potential of it in terms of Australia exporting hydrogen to countries like Korea and Japan. But in order for this industry to really take off here, we're going to need more than $500 million. We're going to need billions of dollars of investment. And to me, that seems like a sensible long-term investment, not just for today's emission targets, but for the hundreds of years to come. And while I do like the technology approach of the Morrison government, I think it's lacking in one key area, and that's electric vehicles. 1 in 10 German vehicles sold are now electric, but here in Australia we are behind the game, and we don't have a target for electric vehicles, we don't subsidise them, and we haven't even got fuel emissions standards. So if we're going to go a technology first approach, we need to back it in with the right amount of money and expand it to include an electrical vehicle strategy.
And just, Will, before I go to the rest of the panel, how much of a difference would that make, electric vehicles, to our pretty modest ambitions? 26 to 28% by 2030 is where we're sitting. I'm sure you can reel the figures off, but much greater commitments being proposed by Japan, Europe, the UK, and certainly we're all waiting to see what the US proposes.
Yeah, first of all, the 26 to 28 is woefully weak. We can do far better than that. A lot of the world now is talking about 50% reduction by 2030. And given our renewable resources, we can even do better than that, and we should do better than that. But how much would electric vehicles make? Well, I think it's a silver buckshot rather than a silver bullet approach.
What does that mean? We don't know enough about guns in this country to know what that means.
Okay, yeah, so everyone talks about a silver bullet or a magic bullet. There is no magic bullet in the climate challenge. We've got to look at all sectors, and certainly transport is an important one. The number one sector, of course, is electricity, and there we can move extremely fast on renewables. But once you get to a renewable electricity sector, then you can start electrifying other sectors like transport, like manufacturing. So yes, we should be ramping up electric vehicles for sure, in sync with the fact that we are going to decarbonize. We're going to decarbonize our electricity sector, but other sectors too are important. So transport, it may help us around 5% or so. All that's important. Every little bit counts. But the electricity sector is the big ticket item that we need to move fastest on just now.
Okay, and so what do you think we should be promising by 2030?
I think we should actually go harder than 50. I think we should aim ostensibly at 75%, get there as close as we can. The ACT has legislated 65 to 75% reduction by 2030. And there's two reasons why I say 75%. One is we've been a laggard. We've been behind what the European Union's been doing, been behind a lot of other countries. We need to play catch up, do more than our fair share. Second of all, we have the best renewable resources of any OECD country. We should grab that opportunity and move quickly on it.
Alexander Downer, it seems extraordinary, 75% by 2030. I mean, that's kind of broadly in line with what the Brits are looking at. They're both centre-right governments, and yet this very different approach. And you hear these comments from people who want to invest in large-scale renewables, right, who say, that's fine, but I need to know that the government's not going to use taxpayer dollars to subsidise gas-fired power plants or coal-fired power plants and mean that my investment's a bust. Now, I wouldn't have thought that that's a conversation you'd need to have with the coalition government in Australia.
Well, look, first of all, different countries have very different circumstances. So in the UK, they have had, in any case, a decline in their industrial base and the abolition of, or the abandonment of their coal industry over the years. And there are all sorts of changes that have taken place which make it easier for them to set targets. But secondly, I don't want to be too cynical about this, but I am experienced in this area. A lot of countries set a lot of targets, including the UK. But I want to see how they're going to meet those targets. I'm with Will there. I think you need a roadmap. You know, I like his metaphor of the trip from Melbourne to Sydney. I want to see how they're going to get there. In the case of the UK, we have no idea how they're going to get there. I mean, the challenge, obviously, is to get emissions down as fast as possible without, at the same time, destroying people's livelihoods. You've got to get that balance right. And that isn't easy. That's why there is such a big debate about it in Australia. I mean, people are enthusiastic to see a reduction in CO2 emissions, but you know, how much is it going to cost to do it? How are we going to do it? And so on. So the only other thing I would say is that I think it's a great idea for the federal government to be putting up this $500 million or so into technology, because it's technological change which is going to get the world through this issue. Not just masses of taxes and throwing people out of work and destroying people's livelihoods. We can't do that.
Patricia, we're very good in this country at innovating, and we're not really good at commercialising our innovations, right? So now we've got $500 million for that kind of research. Do you think we need, as Will says, that kind of federal government coordinating role, price-setting signals, whatever, to make it clear that these are going to be worthwhile investments?
So absolutely. I think there needs to be a roadmap, and I'm really excited about the pivot, whoever's decision it is to pivot, to really focus on climate change. And I really see universities playing a critical role in this. Today, the Times Higher Education put out awards for universities meeting goals in the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think, you know, we need to be fostering technology. We need to be preparing people for jobs that may be very, very different. And I really agree with Alexander. We need to think about what are the social costs. And I think with planning, we have time. Even with electric cars, you know, people talk about electric cars and driverless cars, but once all the driverless vehicles come into play, what's going to happen to truck drivers? These technologies are all on the horizon. And I really think we have to have a societal approach. And having strong policy and signals from government will be a great sort of roadmap and beacon for institutions, not just universities, but business in Australia.
So, Malcolm, what do you think will come out of today? I mean, whether is the $500 million sufficient to go into this meeting? How much pressure does Australia really come under from essentially our great allies, the UK and the US?
Well, you get the impression, because of the timing of these announcements leading up to this summit, that Prime Minister Morrison wanted to turn up, bring a plate, as it were, bringing something along to show his 39 other peers. Look, what will come from this? possibly, and this is just the cynic in me, possibly nothing. But it has powered an expanded debate in the United States on the issue, and here, and no doubt elsewhere. Look, it's such a complicated question in terms of what response you have. Yeah, one Zoom summit is not going to resolve a hell of a lot, but it will at least keep political leaders talking about the issue.
Will, are you an optimist or not? Because presumably you see this from the point of view of physics and not policy. You're trying to do a carbon budget for the planet. Presumably it would be easier if everybody just gave you their numbers, you added them up and you worked out whether we're going to fry or not.
Well, if you add up the numbers that we're sitting at now, we're going to fry. I think when you look at pledges around the world, we'll be somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees, and that's really frying pan territory. So to get to the Paris goal, which is well below 2 degrees, that's a scientific question in terms of how much carbon budget is left, and then you work from that, and that's where we come up with 50% reduction by 2030 globally, net zero by 2040. So yes, there is some definite physics behind that. Whether I'm optimistic sort of depends on whether I have my cup of coffee in the morning or not. But no, really, I think that we're at the cusp of what I call a social tipping point. I spend a lot of my time working on tipping points in the climate system, like permafrost and so on. But there is real momentum building. We see it in the States here. We see it in countries elsewhere. We see it in the private sector, in the finance sector. Once we reach that tipping point where people realize the future actually has so many benefits in terms of employment, new industries, new ways of doing things, that we can move very fast. And I think we're close to that tipping point. That's the optimist in me. Hopefully we'll get there in a few years.
Will, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Will Steffen, who's a climate change expert at the ANU and former science advisor to the Australian Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. Before we go, I just want to raise another potential diplomatic flashpoint, this one with the UK. Trade Minister Dan Tehan is there at the moment. He left the country to meet with his British counterpart Liz Truss to discuss a future trade deal in the lead up to the meeting. Truss is reported to have made some less than gracious comments about our Trade Minister.
She plans to sit him down in an uncomfortable chair, so he has to deal with her directly for 9 hours. He is inexperienced compared to Liz. He needs to show that he can play at this level.
I've got a couple of foreign policy experts here. I could flip a coin. I'm going to start with Sonia. What? Seriously? I'm going to put him in the naughty chair and I'm going to make him really uncomfortable for 9 hours and we'll get better tariffs on our cheese or something. Is that how it works? I don't know.
Oh, gosh, it's been a tough week being an Australian working in foreign policy. We've got the UK calling us inexperienced, the US saying our emissions targets don't measure up. And, you know, when it comes to the comments about Dan Tehan that the UK Trade Minister made, it's moments like this that make me think about becoming a republic. Because what she's talking about is a commonly held notion about Australians in the UK, that we're the, sad younger brother that never matured enough to leave the nest while our older siblings, Canada, the US, India, even Jamaica have. And so becoming a republic is actually a foreign policy imperative for reasons of trade negotiations.
That's it. They've been rude to Dan Tehan. We're short on time, Malcolm. But let me just quickly go to you. Dan Tehan does know what he's talking about. He's a former diplomat.
He's been in that area for a long time, a lot of experience. Look, this was a very clumsy and clunky attempt to soften up the chap who would be sitting across from Ms Truss. And I think its clunkiness has exposed the desperation of Britain to get a deal with us.
OK, we're nearly out of time, Alexander Downer. I have a secret theory that this sort of posturing goes on. And you'd know, you've been in the room where it happens and then you go inside for cigars and cognac. Is that how it goes?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure what sort of a brain explosion led to this briefing of the London Daily Telegraph by somebody in Liz Truss's office, but it's just completely futile. And, Dan Tehan will do a great job. I'd like to know from the UK whether they're going to give us free access to the British market for our sheep meat and beef and sugar and so on. I mean,
Okay.
the British have not put those offers on the table.
Well,
so let's wait and see how today and tomorrow these negotiations go.
And first of all, we need a feather pillow under Dan Tian's behind. That might be a start. Thank you very much. We'll get to the Republic later. Thanks all for joining us. Patricia, Malcolm, Sonia and Alexander Downer in London. Have a good night. Jules is in tomorrow. See ya. Thank you.
We good? Okay, well, thanks, everyone. I've just come straight from a national cabinet meeting with ScoMo and the state captains, and I'm pleased to say the spirit of bipartisanship